Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalia Martin, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Believe it or not, we're approaching the end of the year, and it's once again time for us to discuss top 10 cyber attacks on industry and critical infrastructure, which occurred in 2024. Our panelist is Rees Machtemes, the Director of Industrial Security here at Waterfall Security Solutions, who is, by the way, also a principal researcher on our annual threat report. And he'll give his overview on cyber incidents that impacted physical operations and critical infrastructure. Also, one more thing I'd like to mention, if you have any questions about our solutions in general and would like to speak to one of our experts, I'm going to share a link in the chat box for your convenience, so you can contact us directly. And with that, Rees, turning the stage over to you.
Thank you, Natalia. Welcome, everybody. Today, I want to talk to you about threats to physical operations. And I've reviewed hundreds of incidents in the course of my research this year. I've decided to pick the top 10 incidents from 2024 that I think have been the most important to ICS and OT cybersecurity practitioners. Yes, this is my opinion. The 10 that I chose is subjective. So how about we go through them together? And at the end, I'd love to take your questions and get feedback on what you think about them. And there's many ways to do that. One of the best ways is to add me on LinkedIn and send me a message at any time. I'll be sure to get back to you. And before I forget, in case some of you have to drop out halfway through the show today, I'd like to wish everybody a very happy holidays for myself and everybody at Waterfall. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and best wishes for a prosperous new year in 2025. Let's jump forward and begin. All right, so let's talk a little bit first before I get into the 10 incidents about what we track at Waterfall and what we report on in regards to threat. So everybody should know that Waterfall's 2024 threat report was released back in March. It's a free download, wealth of information inside for anybody in industrial control systems and OT cybersecurity. Go ahead and download it. You can get a copy at waterfall-security.com/2024-threat-report. It is a little bit old though. We have a new edition that will be published in early March, 2025 edition, that we're hard at work on. And some of these incidents that we'll talk about today will be in the upcoming report. They're not in the one on the website now. They're all brand new. And what kinds of things do we track? Well, what our reporting tracks is deliberate attacks, not errors and omissions, with physical consequences to operations. So it's not enough that somebody makes a mistake or presses the wrong button in a control center. No, we track physical consequences that are a result of a cyber attack. And these cyber attacks are attacks on industries that we care about. So these are our customers' industries and the industries that we understand. So just as an example, we wouldn't track things like hospitals and medical. Why? Well, they are critical infrastructure, but their technology and their systems are built and operated differently. And they're not really a classic industrial control system. Another example would be retail operations in something like a grocery chain throughout the country. Arguably, they're critical infrastructure because if you can't eat, you can't survive. However, their point of sale and billing systems are IT systems. They're business systems, and they're just not in scope. They are cyber attacks, but not something that we track. So, however, if there would be an impact to their warehousing or distribution operations, their logistical operations, we would count them. Why? Those kinds of aspects of that business are physically automated. They have industrial control systems, pallet wrappers, they'll have sophisticated inventory management, and this kind of transportation and logistics is a category that we do track. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And by the way, now that we've done introductions, I'm going to turn off my camera here just to save a bit of bandwidth and just focus on the presentation. All right, let's talk a little bit about attack types. The biggest takeaways from our 2024 threat report. So some of the biggest takeaways from our 2024 threat report were that most attacks on OT and ICS with consequences were attributed to ransomware, over 80% of them. And hacktivists are rising in proportion compared to previous years before 2023. And they're important because they predominantly target critical infrastructure, almost exclusively. And not so much things like discrete manufacturing or process manufacturing, but more things like water utilities, energy utilities, and so on. And direct attacks on OT systems and industrial control systems were overwhelmingly perpetrated by nation states and hacktivist groups. Now, what do I mean by direct attacks, indirect attacks? You'll see a pie chart here on your screen. I looked at all the incidents that we had in our report from 2010 when we started to date, and I categorized them by how attacks impacted OT and industrial control systems. And what I discovered is that 2/3 of known attacks where we could attribute, we've had enough information to rate them, we could attribute the attack to a certain type, indirectly impacted OT. What does this mean? This means that, for example, a company will report that out of an abundance of caution, they shut down their operations. So they felt strongly enough that they had to shut down their operations because of some safety risk or risk that the attack might leak from IT into OT and therefore couldn't trust their physical operations. And so they had to shut them down. That was 35% of attacks in our previous report that we could attribute. Another example would be because of dependencies, either on IT systems, so the physical operation depends on IT and business systems, or there is a dependency on third parties. This accounts for another third, and only about 1/3 of attacks target OT directly, where a threat actor is trying to pivot through systems and directly manipulate industrial control systems that are underpinning operations. So those are the big takeaways from last year's or 2024's threat report. So before we move on to our top 10, let's talk quickly about Waterfall security, just so you know a little bit about what we do. If you're not familiar with Waterfall security, Waterfall security has been engaged in providing some of the strongest solutions to critical infrastructure and industrial customers in the private sector since 2007. So that's nearly 18 years now. And we have customers around the globe in over 20 verticals, key ones, which you can see here in power, water, energy, rails, and so on. We have 6 offices around the globe to serve our customers, and we are famous and most well-known for our unidirectional security gateways. We've patented and pioneered this technology, one-way devices and technology that will secure your OT and ICS networks. And just this year, not resting on our laurels, we've just launched a brand new technology, a brand new solution called HERA, Hardware Enforced Remote Access. And we at Waterfall believe, to our knowledge, that it's the strongest and most secure solution on the market available that allows you safe remote access into critical networks. And, as Natalia said, reach out to us at any time if you have any questions about the solutions we offer. We're a solutions-based company. We sell technology, we sell solutions, and that's what we do. So without further ado, let's move on to our top 10 attacks of 2024. I'm going to go through reverse chronological order. I'm going to keep a bit of suspense here. We're going to start with the 10th most important attack and move to the number 1 top 10 attack of the year. So the first attack that I have for you today is an attack on HAL allergy. So, tagline here is they had a bad reaction to ransomware. Trying to keep this a little bit humorous, but it's very, very serious. All these attacks are very serious. When did this one occur? It occurred in February, and it was an indirect attack. So this attack impacted their IT customer data information systems, which then had a physical consequence on their operations. So Ransom House, a ransomware gang, perpetrated a double extortion ransomware attack on HAL. If you're not familiar with what that is, basically double extortion means that first the ransomware group would gain access and encrypt systems, and then after they've encrypted systems, not only will they ransom over the fact that they've locked up their systems and operations, but then try and leverage data that they have stolen from in this case, HAL Allergy, and exfiltrated it, and come back and try and if it doesn't work, ransoming the customer over the locked up operations, they're going to try and ransom the victim over the data that they have stolen. In this case, very compromising patient data. Now, what was the consequence? This delayed order processing and delivery for 32 days. So it helps a little bit to kind of understand what HAL does. HAL is a leader in immunotherapy treatments for allergy sufferers and other products. They focus on allergies. I know a lot about this actually, because I'm one of those people that has taken such a kind of therapy in my lifetime. Like many people, like the famous Alan Turing, who famously wore a gas mask while biking to work at Bletchley Park in the 1940s. He took immunotherapy treatments. And what this is that HAL manufactures serums. They take a little bit of the allergen, like grass pollen or tree pollen, they suspend it in a solution, they package that up, and they send it to your doctor, and then your doctor will put you through a treatment regimen. Now, when you have a company like HAL Allergy, you have to understand that their customer data is integral to the process. They need this data in order to feed it into their systems and produce bespoke or custom allergy serums for their customers, their patients, and then they ship it off to doctors who then give you the treatment. So this kind of attack has a particularly bad impact, impactful impact on a pharmaceutical manufacturer like this. It's much more than just making pills by the millions. This is something where their customer data quite literally is the allergen that they need put into suspension and then given to them in a treatment. So this incident highlights how pharmaceutical manufacturers must protect both their physical operations and sensitive data critical to their process. And sometimes it can also include patented and trade secret formula. So that's number 10 that I have for you. Let's move on to number 9. Number 9, we saw in February an attack on Welch Food. Welch Foods is a food and beverage manufacturer in literally a place called Northeast. It's not Northeast as in the cardinal direction, Northeast Pennsylvania. This is a borough of Erie County in Pennsylvania. Large food factory went down for 3 weeks. This was a cyber attack. Now, we don't really know much details about how this incident occurred because Welch didn't release it publicly, and this is quite typical. And we also know that this incident occurred because their local union said that many workers were put out of work. Over 200 workers were sent home for 3 weeks. These were the consequences after the production shutdown. And what's notable about this incident, it is becoming increasingly common that we see food and beverage manufacturers, especially traditional production plants like Welch Foods, shut down due to ransomware. It's quite common that you see many workers sent home for weeks on end. And when you have a manufacturer like this in food and beverage, their number one goal is to get the plant back up and running safely and their operators and workers back to work as soon as possible. And this is why attacks on companies like Welch Foods are so impactful, because you're not only losing money, not making anything, but nobody has work. Nobody's going to work. And many people are really suffering without making a living. Hourly workers at a food plant are not paid when they're laid off because of a shutdown like this. And this was one of the largest ones we saw in food and beverage in 2024. Next one. So the next one is an attack on Ride Movi, which is a bicycle rideshare company in Bologna, Italy. In fact, Ridemovi actually has operations in over 40 cities in Europe, where they basically will rent out bicycles. Some of them are going to be traditional bicycles with pedals. A lot of them are modern with LiPo batteries, and they're electric bicycles. In this case, they're e-bikes that were impacted by a cyber attack. Now, this cyber attack is very unusual. You might argue that, Rees, this is not an attack on a control system. You might be right. Let's debate that. Let's talk about it. Here's a funny anecdote that I find illustrates how counterintuitive public transit is. So I am lucky enough to spend many summers and springs in Tokyo. And so I see a lot of rain in Tokyo. And on my commutes around Tokyo, one of the things that really shocked me was that on a rainy day, buses are packed like sardines. Trains are absolutely packed. And I never expected that. And maybe that's because as somebody from a snowy country where we get lots of cold weather, we don't see anybody riding public transit on a cold, bad weather day. But, and that's what I thought would happen in a city like Tokyo, but that's not what happens. In fact, they're busier than ever. Why? Well, all those walkers and joggers and bikers find the first bus they can get on when it's pouring with rain, and they get on board because they have a life to live. They have places to go, work to go to, school, and so on. Everybody rides public transit, and so you can barely get a spot when it's pouring with rain on a bus or train in Tokyo. So in the same way, imagine a city like Bologna. This is a city where their CEO said that in the first quarter of 2024, they had more than 500,000 trips taken on their bikes in the city. So in this case, we had a pirate smartphone app, a shadow app set up called Ride and Goatee. Sounds a little bit like a mobster style gangster app that was put up on app stores that customers, or not customers, but people could download and then unlock and ride these electronic bikes for free without needing to subscribe to the official service called Ridemovi. And this illegal bike use became so widespread that all the bicycles were just left junked on the side of the road, hucked in rivers and in ditches, left without a charge, damaged, and of course, untraceable because the smartphone app that was used to unlock and allow people to ride these bikes no longer worked. And that's how Ridemovi knows where their bikes are. That's part of the integrated system they use. So this incident highlights how, as the world shifts to ride-sharing gig economy, self-driving cars, how smart apps and software is integral to that system. And if that system breaks down, or if there's a problem, in this case, a type of supply chain attack where there's a shadow app set up that doesn't work properly with the official service, you now have a problem with public transport in your city. All right, next incident, number 7. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes in. Let's see if we can pick up the pace a bit. Okay, so next incident was an attack on a hotel chain, Omni Hotels. What happened? Well, ransomware hit Omni Hotels' IT network. So this was an indirect attack. And why am I counting this? An attack on something like a retail hotel chain perhaps is not countable. It doesn't impact control systems. Well, in this case, like the MGM attack last year on MGM casinos and resorts, this attack impacted building control systems. Building control systems were directly tied into the IT network, which meant that once the cyber attack encrypted IT systems at Omni, none of their room key cards could open rooms, and they couldn't lock or unlock rooms. Their reservation system was down, which not only meant that existing customers were in trouble that had existing reservations, but they were not able to facilitate getting any new customers into rooms. So effectively, their entire operation shut down. You cannot utilize the buildings. Now, this was not in the news report, but also you have to keep in mind that in almost all modern hotels, the HVAC and power, lighting is all controlled and automated through building management systems. So we don't know if they were impacted, but likely they were. So you're not staying in a hotel in March without heat. or perhaps even air conditioning, depending on where those hotels are in North America. What did this cost? I had to estimate this. Omni Hotels did not release this figure, but it just is an estimated rough cost of what this would cost Omni. Is they said they weren't able to put any people in hotel rooms for 11 days, which means that a rough estimate would be $40 million in lost revenue. 11 days. They say they have 20,000 rooms throughout their 50 hotels in their chain at a rough, average $100 a night. Easy to come up with 40 million in lost revenue, which compares actually to the 110 million that MGM claimed last year in losses, in not only lost revenue, but in remediation and restoration costs. This is extremely impactful and the biggest one we saw in building automation in 2024. Next incident. Number 6, Black Basta halts manufacturing at Keytronic for 2 weeks. Keytronic, what is it? Well, Keytronic is one of the top 10 circuit board manufacturers in the United States. They make printed circuit board assemblies. So you can either just have bare boards made for you, or you can have them populated with electronic components. And this is what Keytronic does. And how did this happen? Well, they were indirectly impacted by a ransomware attack. They didn't say which gang hit them. And this ransomware attack crippled their systems on the IT network. Out of an abundance of caution, they said they shut down their physical operations. And in fact, later on went to say that it cost them 17 million in lost revenue and restoration costs. By the way, if I didn't mention it already, it impacted not only their plants in the US, but also in Mexico. And really here, the significance of this attack is not just the millions in dollars in lost revenue and remediation expenses, but it's an illustrative example again of how ransomware continues to disproportionately impact manufacturers and indirectly shut down operations. And one other thing I might want to add is, keep in mind the larger context here. When you have a manufacturer like Keytronic that goes down, think of all their customers. Think of all the people that contract them to produce boards. It might be those computer companies, you want your latest graphics card, but it's much more likely that there's a lot of government and critical infrastructure that relies on Keytronic indirectly to produce the electronics they need in the OT and ICS systems that they end up using. So it's going to have a supply chain impact in manufacturing throughout industry. And right now, nothing is more important than electronics manufacturing to many customers throughout North America. Next incident, number 5. Barnett's Couriers. Barnett's Couriers is a trucking company, or was a trucking company in North Wollongong in Australia. And here, attack details, including the threat actor and how they gained access, were not really released by Barnett's. They didn't really say much about this incident. And that's not a surprise, as the attack caused them to go bankrupt. And in such a situation, any lawyer worth their salt will tell management not to say too much. After all, they'll have many creditors waiting to get paid, not to mention all the employees left without any work at all. Those employees in a trucking company may actually own and operate their own rigs, their own 18-wheelers. And this can be quite devastating to absolutely everybody involved. And my heart goes out to this company and their employees and their customers. And in our current 2024 threat report, we list actually 3 past bankruptcies. We have Caledonian Modular, Prophet, and K&P Logistics Group currently in our threat report. Caledonian was a UK prefab building constructor. They made prefabricated buildings. Prophet was a German bicycle maker. They made bicycles. And K&P Logistics was similar to Barnett's. They were a trucking co. in the UK. Actually, this year so far, we have 3 new bankruptcies to report in our upcoming threat report. We have this one, Barnett's, which was quite significant in the logistics and transportation industry. We have Schumag AG, which is a German precision machining and tool company. They make tooling for machinists. And we have the Stoli Group, which is most famous for their, famous vodka. And more details about those bankruptcies and cyber attacks will be published in our upcoming threat report in March. Next one, number 4. Almost everybody, I'm sure, has probably heard about all the cyber attacks on water treatment systems in early 2024. There was a whole slew of them that impacted cities and small utilities, many of them without any consequences on Abernathy, Hale Center, Tipton, Arkansas City, and many others. Many of them were in Texas. And one of them had physical consequences, and that's why we're talking here about the attack on Muleshoe, Texas. And the attack on Muleshoe, Texas had consequences. The attack caused water tanks to overflow for 30 minutes. So this is an incident I'd like to dive into quite a bit more. We're getting into our last top 4 incidents, and this one seems benign. It seems like, okay, so we made tanks overflow for 30 minutes. What to do? We lost a bit of water. Everybody still had water in Muleshoe, Texas. Nobody went without. What's the big deal here? The big deal is that there appears to be a large campaign against water treatment plants in the United States and elsewhere. There were some other related incidents to these attacks. It appears to be a part of a large hacktivist campaign by a so-called self-titled Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, who bragged about attacks on these used water treatment plants, including a utility in Poland and a utility in France. And what they did is they posted screenshots and videos of their cyber attacks on Telegram. And on their Telegram channel, what they showed was random clicks and manipulations of HMIs, human machine interfaces. It seemed to be that they were just trying to stir up things and make people worry. And then what happened is later on, Muleshoe, Texas came out and said, yes, we actually had a cyber attack and it did cause an overflow. And they said, yes, it's related to what you saw from this hacktivist group, Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. This story gets even more complex because later on, Mandiant, Google's Mandiant group, put out detailed analysis linking these cyber attacks by Cyber Army of Russia Reborn to Russia's Sandworm nation-state threat actor group. And evidence showed that CAR was operated by Sandworm, which is actually a specialized unit, Unit 74455 of Russia's GRU, which is their military intelligence. And Sandworm has been responsible for many attacks, especially all the attacks on energy and power providers in the Ukraine in 2015 and 2016, and many others around the world. And so although the evidence couldn't say that CAR was in fact Sandworm, what it did say was that it's very credible that Sandworm is controlling or has a direct, management of Cyber Army of Russia Reborn. And so this has really escalated these attacks that are all related and linked to CAR to larger nation-state threat activity, resulted in many CISA advisories and by other agencies in Five Eyes countries. And what's notable and important about these attacks is that they are kind of akin to those old attacks you used to see between militaries. Okay, think of it like when militaries send aircraft into an opponent's airspace, and then there's a bit of a game played where you scramble fighter jets to intercept. And these kinds of attacks are thought by experts to be testing capabilities and defensive response times and tactics. So although the impact was small, 30 minutes of tanks overflowing in Muleshoe only, this is part of a much, much larger campaign testing defensive capabilities throughout America and the United States as allies. And this is why this attack by CAR and Sandworm is important this year. All right, let's move on to number 3. There's 3 more to go. The next one, moss collectors sensors disabled by novel, pardon my French, this sounds really bad. I don't know how else to say this. I didn't coin this name, okay? This was coined by Clarity and perhaps others. They call this FUXNet malware. When did it happen? In April. So let's talk a little bit about this incident. What is this? Novel malware. Why does this matter? Well, this was a direct attack on OT. What happened is that Blackjack, which is a claimed that they had attacked Moss Collector. Blackjack is a threat actor group that's part of Ukraine's SBU. So Ukraine's SBU is their government equivalent of the GRU. This is their military intelligence group responsible for carrying out nation state attacks. And keep in mind, they're in the middle of a war right now with Russia. So this is the kind of thing that goes on routinely. And what is Moss Collector? Well, Moss Collector is a state-owned company in Moscow, the capital of Russia, which monitors many parameters to help heat, cool, and power utility customers throughout the city. So these sensors are distributed throughout the city, measuring temperatures, measuring pressures, and helping basically supply utilities to the entire city. And Moss Collector, actually, you can find out a lot more about them directly from their own website, and mentions that for decades, they've maintained a network of sensors throughout underground utility tunnels in the city of Moscow. And what the Ukrainians have done, what Blackjack has done, is created a novel malware strain that directly attacks OT systems. It attacks the sensor gateways with malware that's capable of talking industrial control system protocols, in this case RS-485, which is a serial protocol, MBus protocol, the MBus serial protocol, and also it can brick and is capable of wiping flash memory chips in these sensor gateways and other IoT devices that monitor utilities throughout Moscow, utility service throughout Moscow, sorry. So when we have a nation state threat actor developing brand new malware to target OT systems and hardware and directly wipe, brick, or misoperate them, this is a cause for concern, no matter which side of conflict you're on. It's an escalation in tactics, techniques, and procedures. And why are we talking about this? This sounds like a one-sided attack. Blackjack is part of the Ukrainian side in a conflict. Are they telling the truth? Well, we know that they're telling the truth in this case because Clarity got a hold of the malware and deeply analyzed it. If you want more information about this, you can just Google Clarity FUXNet malware, and you'll find their report that tells you all about this malware and its capabilities. And it's worth looking into if you're an ICS and OT cybersecurity analyst, and your job is to understand how this kind of malware can operate. Number 2. This is, in some ways, probably the incident that caused the Ukrainians to retaliate against Russia. So here now we have another novel malware called Frosty Goop that directly attacked OT and ICS systems in the city of Lviv in Ukraine. So let's talk about this incident. What happened? So this was back in January. So this was the first incident that was similar this year, where we saw attacks by nation states on utilities, in this case, heating utilities or energy utilities. And in the city of Lviv, like many cities, especially in Eastern Europe, but it happens in North America too, you've got a company, a utility company that heats homes, and they heat homes by usually natural gas boilers. They heat a lot of, large quantity of water, and they distribute heated water throughout neighborhoods to heat them through radiant heaters. And in the middle of January, this kind of heating service is extremely important. Now, it's a little bit old-fashioned in North America for those of you that have forced air heating, let's say. but heating by water is extremely efficient. And this is a time-honored tradition. Have a local utility, boil large quantities of waters and supply it for efficiency reasons. Let's get it out to all the people that need heat. It's a great way to economize in scale your heating. On the other hand, it reports it's a single point of failure in the case of a cyber attack like this. And how do we know about this? Well, in this case, it was Dragos that got a hold of this Frosty Goop malware and analyzed it and looked into this attack. And what they found is that the threat actor, in this case, was later linked to Sandworm by Andy Greenberg at Wired. Russia and Sandworm have developed a new novel malware, Frosty Goop, and they inserted it into OT and ICS systems by first compromising internet-facing microtic routers or microtik routers. They found a 0-day and microtik routers. They got this malware into IT and OT systems at this utility, which then basically was able to shut off the heat and manipulate valves and control systems controlling the heat to entire neighborhoods. 600 homes were impacted. So this is quite impactful. And what Dragos said in the report, one of the things that I think was the most significant about what they said in their report was that this not only is this a new novel malware developed by nation state to directly manipulate OT networks and systems, but that this attack allowed the threat actor to create basically a tunnel into OT and ICS systems and manipulate them in almost real time, directly manipulate them. They set up this communication pathway by pivoting through systems through the internet facing routers, and then are able to embed this malware and remotely manipulate things in real time. And to their knowledge, they said this has never been done before. There's been plenty of malware that targets ICS and OT systems, and it might be autonomous and runs by itself once it's deployed, or might have some kind of remote access Trojan style malware that's deployed where you're remotely manipulating things and turning things on or off. But in this case, what they said was that they're in real time manipulating OT and ICS systems. And I thought this was notable and worth talking about, and why I put this one ahead of number 3. All right, let's move on to our number 1 top 10 most impactful, most important attack on ICS and OT of 2024. And it's Volt Typhoon. Oh, but Rees, why are you talking about Volt Typhoon? That's last year's news. Yes, but not really. Actually, Volt Typhoon has proven to be the threat actor and near miss that just doesn't go away. It's like the cat came back, just doesn't want to stay away. In fact, actually, Volt Typhoon doesn't just not want to stay away. It has been an ongoing threat throughout 2024, where this threat actor has continually attempted to regain persistence in networks and have the ability to manipulate OT and ICS systems if need be, if they wish to. So let's be clear here. This is one of the few incidents in our top 10 list where there were no physical consequences. So again, why am I talking about it? It's because of the larger context and how high profile this is, and how persistent the threat actor has been to continually maintain access to the networks that they have infected. So if you haven't heard last year, you can go to our threat report and read about what we said about Volt Typhoon in 2023. But just to quickly summarize 2023's story about Volt Typhoon is that Microsoft discovered them almost by accident in 2023. And they were found to have been active since 2021. And Volt Typhoon will use so-called living off the land techniques to maintain persistence in networks. What does that mean? So the threat actor Volt Typhoon will attempt to be as stealthy as possible, so they they try not to trigger any anti-malware, IDS, or EDR, that's intrusion detection or endpoint detection systems and response systems. They'll use 0 days to gain initial access to things like routers, modems, and IP or internet-enabled cameras, and then pivot into other networks. In fact, in some of the early reports, they have found to have penetrated into OT networks and then quickly back out. So there's evidence in some sites where there has been logging enabled, where they've seen the threat actor pivot into OT and then say, uh-oh, we don't actually want to stay here, and then go back to the IT network and maintain their persistence there. And then they will use tools that are already inside that network. So things like Windows has built-in networking tools, or they might use built-in scripting languages like PowerShell, which exists on every Windows machine, in order to continue to maintain persistence and explore and conduct reconnaissance within those networks. And these networks aren't just any networks. They're networks in private utilities, mostly around the world, that have contracts with the US government. They have what's called services supply agreements to the US government. They're things like transportation, shipping ports, water utilities, power and oil and gas providers that provide services to the US government in its operations around the world. And the real worry here by the US government, and this has been put out in statements by their agencies, is that in a time of conflict, like perhaps when China may wish to invade Taiwan, Bolt Typhoon, which is a Chinese nation-state threat actor, could then spring into action and then carry out attacks on OT systems because they have maintained persistence within those IT networks. In 2024, some of the developments in the story is that the FBI gets an unbelievably unusual court order. This is extremely rare. And they got a court order to go basically into small home office routers and remotely wipe malware from customers' equipment, basically without notifying them or letting them know. So this is literally the FBI going into routers that are exposed to the internet, uploading new firmware and rebooting those devices with patches to prevent what's called the KV botnet, which is the botnet that Volt Typhoon created to maintain their persistence in a lot of these internet-enabled devices. The KV botnet was expunged, and the FBI effectively is saying, declaring mostly a victory. They said, yes, we've got in there and we wiped this malware and this botnet out of all these infected devices. But there's a little bit of a catch, because as you might know, legally the FBI and the US government can't do this in devices that are not owned by US citizens. They can't do that in Canadians' devices or in British devices, let's say, or anybody else's devices that might be infected around the world. And so did they really eliminate the entire botnet? Probably not, but they declared victory at the time. It was a huge success, and it was an unprecedented success, actually, because it's extremely rare that a government agency would get the ability to go and do this and impact privately owned equipment. And then the story kind of develops a little bit further in June. It was found that Volt Typhoon had breached Singtel in Singapore. They found a vulnerability in a management software for SD-WAN, that's software-defined wide area networking equipment. They installed web shells, which is a way that they can remotely access IT systems by deploying what's called a web shell. You can Google it if you're not sure what that is or don't know what that is. And needless to say, that was an alarming breach. Now, Singapore, that's not the US. Why do we care? Well, actually, they're allies. They're allies. And more than that, this was seen as a kind of test run attack for what they could do more directly to US telecommunications providers. Why are they interested in getting into a SD-WAN or gaining a foothold in a wide area network hardware device? Well, because this entire attack is about hiding and obfuscating the origin of where these threat actors are coming from and making it very difficult to remove their persistence in networks. More to the story, I mean, it just keeps developing. In November, there was found to be more end-of-life Cisco network and Netgear small home office routers infected, again with KV botnet. And so this became a big news story in November. And really, this Volt Typhoon story just ceases to go away. And it's really caused a loss of confidence in cyber defenses when you have a threat actor stealthily hiding in networks and doing their utmost to not be detected, even if you think you've completely removed them from your networks. Have you? This really, I think, is the biggest story of 2024 for all of us in ICS and OT cybersecurity. All right, let's sum up. It's been 46 minutes. Let's sum up what to expect in 2025. I mean, again, this is my opinion or my own predictions, but let's talk a little bit about it. I think we're going to see probably a similar total incident count. So last year we reported around 68 incidents with physical consequences to OT and ICS systems in our threat report. In the past, we've seen kind of a hockey stick graph where that's been rapidly rising. I'm not sure if we're going to see such a larger increase this year, but we'll at least see the same number of incidents this year as we did last year. Now, that sounds, again, like maybe we have less to worry about, but I really don't think so. One of the things that we've consistently seen throughout 2024 is that there are higher incidents of significant attacks attributed to nation states and hacktivists, attacks that are impactful and concerning. And so I think we're going to see that proportion of attacks increase. We might see less ransomware attacks causing shutdowns and physical incidents. We might. It's a prediction, but that looks to be kind of the trend that we're seeing so far this year. I think we should expect to see in 2025 more and more incident disclosure rules either coming into force or being made and passed into law. We're going to see more regulations on cybersecurity. Why? Because the threat level has been ratcheted up. Incident counts have been rising over the past 5 and 6 years, and the proportion of attacks being attributed to hacktivists and nation states is rising. And this is going to really create a situation where more has to be done. Now, about that, there's basically been a new step added here when it comes to regulation and rules and the legal regulatory environment. And we're seeing less and less disclosures. You know, why are we seeing less ransomware attacks? Well, one possibility is that because of these new rules and regulation that are coming out about disclosure, there's a new step at every organization, and that is contact your legal team first. You get hit by ransomware, contact legal right away, and contact your PR agency. And you now need to be very careful about what you say. You'll see more and more conservative statements and on public incidents that contain fewer details about how the attack unfolded. And that's because you have to be careful about what you say. There will also be an increased societal pressure to defend around the world. You know, why are we seeing new rules and regulations? Because society will be putting pressure on governments, on organizations, on privately owned utilities, on publicly traded companies to be more transparent and up their defenses. And so you're going to see this kind of back and forth between the societal pressure and regulation and organizations that are trying to conduct business. Also, you know, we talked a little bit about increasing attack sophistication. I think you're going to see an arms race here. So even though we're seeing less, you know, apparently less ransomware attacks, perhaps because of these disclosure rules, there is in effect an arms race here as defenders step up their defenses and get better at defending against ransomware. Attackers are going to compete by perhaps turning more to physical shutdowns because the double extortion ransomware, triple extortion ransomware attacks are not working for them and not giving them the payday that they're looking for. So they're going to up their game, perhaps by, for example, developing ways to target OT and ICS systems in order to shut down organizations and create this arms race situation and increase their attack sophistication. And lastly, I think we're going to see an increased enforcement action. Again, there's many, many different kinds of enforcement. We've seen a lot of arrests, sanctions placed on threat actors, criminal groups, individual people related to all these cyber attacks we've seen. But I just want to, it's quite obvious to many people, but this problem just isn't easily solved by legal measures. It's after the fact, it's reactionary. There's certain places where you cannot go after people because they're in a jurisdiction where you cannot extradite them or they don't face any legal consequences. And in some cases, threat actors are being protected by their governments, or going after certain people may create international incidents. And so this won't necessarily solve the problem of how do you stop cyber attacks. But it is welcome, of course, to see many of the threat actors and people like the Scattered Spider ransomware gang getting caught and put behind bars this year. All right, feedback's welcome. Add me on LinkedIn. You can use the QR code. By the way, all these top 10 attacks are being released today on our website through a new infographic. Don't worry about where the URL is. All of that will be mailed out to all attendees today. So I thank you so much for joining. And with that, can we switch to the Q&A session, Natalia?
Thank you, Rees, for this very informative presentation. Yes, we have a few questions from the audience. The first question goes back to a very first incident. The question is, how did Hall Allergy solve the attack?
How did they solve the attack? Is that the question?
Yes.
Honestly, I really don't know. So I followed, and this is typical. So one of the things we do in our threat report is we only look at publicly disclosed incidents. It does us no good to look at incidents that might have been brought to our attention privately by our customers. We just can't have a conversation about something that isn't in the public domain. And in this case, the information I have about the attack on Hall Allergy comes from the press. In fact, it predominantly comes from their own press releases. And again, going back to increased regulation, disclosure rules, and this kind of call your lawyer first issue, it doesn't contain any information about how they solved it. And this is quite typical. They just simply said, after 32 days, we're back and running again. So we don't know.
Okay, thank you. What about the Okta and MGM breach?
How did they solve the Okta and the MGM breach?
Yes, yeah, that was the
So
question.
it's exact same thing. Maybe perhaps you meant Omni Hotels Group. We don't really know how they solved this either, but what typically happens in these kind of cases, and we know a lot about how MGM solved their issue because there's been a lot of public disclosure about the number of people that were brought in to do the response and recovery. But almost always, the way that this works is you basically call up every contractor, every automation expert that you can. You bring them into your plant, you bring them in on overtime, you open your wallets, and you're going to also be calling all law enforcement, especially in countries like Germany, where law enforcement is heavily involved in response. That's not so much the case, perhaps, in the United States or Canada and in North America, but you're going to bring in law enforcement if you can. You're going to do forensic analysis. You're going to try and figure out how they got in. You're going to try and figure out what they, what method they used to gain initial access and patch your systems so that the threat actor can no longer gain access to your systems. And that's why you see outages like 11 days in Omni Hotels and 32 days at Hall Allergy. It might take quite a long time for them to be absolutely sure that they can resume operating safely. And it's typical that a pharmaceutical manufacturer would take longer than a hotel group. Why? Think of all the private customer data. I mean, this is patient information about what kind of allergies they have and what kind of therapy you're going to make for them. You need to also try and figure out how that data was exfiltrated and stop that from happening. That may not have an impact on your OT ICS systems, but in some rare cases, like in a pharmaceutical manufacturer, it might be deeply embedded and integrated. You have to look at your architecture, how you built your system, your manufacturing plant. Do you have to change the way you do things and re-engineer it, redesign it, redo it, because the way that you did it maybe wasn't segmented enough or wasn't safe enough? What kind of technology do you have to go and buy? Do you got to deploy some gateways, for example, to make sure that operations are only one way, or some kind of new remote access technology like HERA that would make it safer for you to remotely administer things? These things all have to be done, and it's very costly. But we just don't know in these cases.
I see. Thank you. Next question about the points about being careful what you say as opposed to greater transparency. What is intended here?
Sorry, one more time, Natalia.
The next question is about, you mentioned that companies needs to be careful what they say when the incident happens, as opposed to greater transparency. So what is intended?
There's an ongoing debate right now about cyber attacks everywhere in the public domain, in society at large. How much information should be made publicly available after a cyber attack in the hopes that we can learn something from this and fix it, versus protecting an organization. Think about when you release information in after a cyber attack. Many of these things are deeply related to insider trading. A public disclosure of costs is important to inform your shareholders, but at the same time might make you legally liable for perhaps something you did or did not do properly as an organization. And that will completely change. You need to contact, have a great legal team and contact them for advice at this point. What allergy might experience in Europe will be completely different than a pharmaceutical manufacturer in the United States, for example, because the law will be completely different. And this is being hammered out as we speak. It's not settled. Are we going to see SEC disclosures in the United States after the inauguration in January? We don't know. It might be that such things are not done anymore. It might be that the SEC doubles down and increases rules. So this is what I mean is, the future's uncertain. A little bit of a prediction there, but I can foresee both situations happening. But more likely, less disclosure is more likely to happen. There's just too many things at stake by disclosing information about cyber attacks. And that's my opinion.
Yeah. The next question is, what are the countermeasures to protect the OT infrastructure of this type of attack?
What are the countermeasures? So you'll notice that in nearly every one of these incidents, threat actors are able to indirectly or directly shut down physical operations and industrial control systems. And while no system is ever secure, one of the things we have pioneered at Waterfall, and one of the things that's considered best practice in industry, is to tackle things like segmentation between your networks, ensure that your IT network and your OT or your operational network is strongly segmented and has very strong defenses at what's called the IT-OT boundary, or in between both networks. And to also think very carefully about dependencies. If you depend on third-party services or services in the cloud, if you depend on assets or information in your IT network, you need to think carefully about how you make connections between those networks and how parts of your entire operations interact, to make sure that if a cyber attack cripples, let's say, your IT network, your operations don't shut down. Or that critical information to your processing and production facilities, like let's say at Hal Allergy, is protected inside the OT network and cannot be stolen or exfiltrated or manipulated to cause production problems in your OT network. And so solutions like unidirectional gateways and HERA is the kind of thing that can be of great help to organizations.
Thank you. Well, we are approaching the top of the hour. Let's just take one more question and we can wrap it up. Are OT component manufacturers solving for the vulnerabilities in their products?
So if I understood you correctly, the question is, are OT manufacturers solving problems in their products to prevent these kind of incidents from occurring?
I guess, yes.
Yes, they're all hard at work. CIS has put out this campaign, Secure by Design, in 2024. But I see Andrew's on the line. He's the VP of Industrial Security at Waterfall. Andrew, did you want to say a few words about OT devices and manufacturers bettering their designs? Perhaps he's just listening in. But what I will say is that it's incredibly important to come up with better OT hardware, better industrial control system hardware designs, find software and firmware bugs in those products and squash them out, and improve the protocols that are used in OT and ICS networks. At the end of the day, though, all software is vulnerable to cyber attack. One of the things we've seen are many vulnerabilities and 0 days exploited in hardware that allows threat actors to manipulate OT systems. And effectively, that's why you need to put in a layered defense in depth into your OT and ICS system design. Cyber-informed engineering out of the Department of Energy and Idaho National Labs is a great program to follow. It talks a lot about a holistic, big picture way to engineer and design and build and operate ICS systems, because effectively, even if you were able to fix every single bug in current hardware, in their firmware, and improve protocols so that they're much more resilient and maybe have end-to-end encryption in them, still systems would be vulnerable to shutdown and to physical consequences. So you need to do more than just simply improve your OT devices.
Thank you, Rees. And with that, I think we can conclude our presentation for today. Rees, any last word?
No, just happy holidays to everybody, and thank you all for joining us and following me and this webinar today.
Thank you. And on behalf of Waterfall, would like to thank you for joining us today. Happy holidays, and we'll see you next time.